Hi, good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to our latest in a series of webinars from VROC. Today we will be discussing renewable energy strategies, and joining me are two experts from the renewable energy industry, Gavin and Marc Allen. So thank you for joining me this morning. Just to let everyone in the audience know, at the end of this discussion, Marc and Gavin will be fielding some questions from you guys, so please use the chat function to send questions throughout the webinar, and we'll ensure to get as many as we can answered at the end. I'd like to start by introducing my guests that I have here today. Firstly, we've got Gavin Smart. Gavin is the Head of Analysis and Insights for Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, or ORE Catapult as they're more commonly known. And Gavin is responsible for developing and maintaining ORE Catapult's financial and economic modelling, which feeds directly into the organization's commercial strategy and generating insights from their projects. Then we also have Marc Allen. Marc, thanks for joining us. Marc is the Climate Change Risk Advisor and Technical Director for Engeco. Marc is a chemical engineer with over 20 years experience, and he has spent the last 12 years specializing in sustainability and climate change. So before we get started and discussing what we're going to go through today, I thought it would be great if you could both tell us a little bit more about what your respective companies do. If we start with Gavin.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks very much, Ian. ORE Catapult is the UK's leading technology and innovation centre for offshore renewable energy. So we work across offshore wind, wave and tidal, and we work a lot with large industry to understand what the industry's issues are. And then we work with small, medium enterprises so that those kind of small, agile innovators are doing their solutions are going to be tailored to meet the needs of the industry. So we work a lot within industry. We work also with policymakers and with academia. And I guess in a way, our role is to be a bit of a hub in the middle of a number of spokes to make sure that everyone in the industry is pulling in the right direction.
Excellent. And Marc?
Yeah, thanks. And good morning, everyone, or evening, wherever you are. So yes, I'm currently based in Singapore with my company Engeco. Engeco is a climate change risk advisory company. So I help businesses understand the risks associated with climate change and develop climate change strategy. And work across the whole value chain of climate change work, everything from calculating emissions for a facility or for a company, through analysing what are the risks you're exposed to as a result of those emissions today and in the future. And then finally, what can you do about it? Do you have abatement options? Should you be pivoting into something like renewables and or taking advantage of renewable energy as well?
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for that introduction. And without further ado, I think we'll get started and go through some of the questions we have for you. Firstly, just a discussion point. With the current oil prices and pressure from governments to reduce carbon emissions, oil companies are fast-tracking their transformation to become renewable energy companies. From your experience in both renewables and in oil and gas, how can these organizations ensure they succeed with this investment and apply the lessons learned from the oil and gas industry? And if I could start with you, Marc, on that one, that'd be great.
Sure. So, there has been a lot of movement across the oil and gas industry to pivot now to be more known as an energy company. And some companies have set some pretty big targets and are putting a lot of money into alternative energy, renewables, hydrogen, all these other things to move away from just being known as the company that supplies hydrocarbons to the company that supplies energy more broadly. And you've got companies like Shell making commitments to be the largest electricity providers and going around and actually supporting that with some really interesting strategic investments around offshore wind and battery companies and network operators and electric vehicle charging stations and all these things to underpin this growth going forward and setting aside quite a sizable amount of capital into this area that they call new energies. And I think that's just the start of the story. There'll be more, I think, movement from other oil and gas companies in the future. It's currently a story between the Euro majors and the US majors, and varying levels of entry into the renewables industry, depending on the region you're from. So, and I think, what can they do? It's about setting these goals and having targets and having a roadmap, and then diverting capital away from traditional oil and gas expenditure, drilling holes and exploring reservoirs, into some of this broader energy market.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And Gavin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I can I definitely agree with everything that Marc said, and I suppose building on that a bit, the point around having a plan for this transition, I think is really key. So targets and understanding kind of how companies are going from their current business model to what that model needs to look like. And I think part of that is, it almost goes without saying, but it's doing the industry research. So getting the right expectations about what's in store as you start pivoting towards more renewable activity. So understanding the industry structure, understanding the kind of level of margins and the key players, what are the consenting issues, etc. So things like that are key. So research and expectations, but also I think there are opportunities for partnering and getting involved in existing renewable industry kind of organisations and partnerships. And just to give some examples, so Marc called out Shell there in terms of some of their activities. We've seen them coming into offshore wind, in some joint ventures in Europe, also doing things in the US. See people like Total coming and getting involved in some floating ventures in the UK, partnering up with pure play offshore wind developers. And they're also kind of joining in some joint industry projects which Catapult are running. So there's a kind of, raising their own visibility and kind of doing learning by doing, by partnering with the right people, I think is a really good approach.
Excellent. And going on from that and talking about wind power a little bit more, wind power is expected to be able to deliver power to all UK homes by 2030. With governments around the world shifting focus to wind power, what needs to be done to ensure that it can meet the increasing demands of the grid and do that while still reducing production costs? And if I can start with you, Gavin, on this one, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to this integration side, between generation and grids, I think the key thing is just more of a joined up approach between all the key players. So the kind of the obvious ones that you mentioned there, we're talking about the generators and the grid operators, but there's a bigger picture there. You've also got the energy regulators, and you get the government policy makers, both at a national level and a local level. So I think really kind of joined up approach where you've got the planning of what energy infrastructure is needed on the ground to transmit energy to consumers, being joined up with where we're planning to deploy renewable capacity. So obviously from my point of view, I think a lot about offshore wind. And so, kind of offshore transmission points. At the moment, we have a very market-led approach in terms of lowest bidders being able to get their sites away, where they've developed them. I think over time, as we're reaching this critical mass, is maybe a bit dramatic, but as we scale up like this, I think there needs to be a lot more planning in terms of where we want our gigawatts of power and when, and how that feeds into the demand side.
Okay, excellent. And Marc?
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that. And absolutely, I think there's a lot of benefit in taking a systems level approach to the entire grid. I think potentially, the history of renewable energy has been people just putting generators in places and just pushing it into the grid, and there it goes, right? And increasingly, regulators and network operators have this realization that that's possibly not the way to do things, because it makes an unstable grid once you get to high renewables penetration. So it needs to be, I think, yes, this systems level approach to grid management and grid operation and grid development, and also I think incorporation of storage to try and counteract some of the intermittency, and whether that's lithium-ion batteries, which have their purpose in terms of grid stability, frequency control, or something a bit more novel like a redox flow battery, which is a lot better for large scale storage, and then moving into hydrogen or compressed air or cryogenic air or some of the physical storage things, pumped hydro, to give you this ability to store the energy from when you're potentially spilling it to using it when you actually need it during peak times. And then coupled with that, as Gavin just pointed out, it's the whole demand management side as well. So managing the whole thing as one unit and optimizing your supplies to your demand as much as possible across the entirety of the grid.
Excellent. Thank you both for that. And in your opinion, what are the biggest obstacles and opportunities facing renewable energy investment in the near future? Marc, if I could go to you again on this one first, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So I still think there's a perception around risk with renewables, and they're also lower risk and they give you lower returns, which for some investors might not pass the hurdle rate. And then you've got the added issue that sometimes the projects are a little bit too small for banks or lenders or big investors to want to be involved in, because they just don't meet their minimum requirements, because you're not spending $1 billion or $20 billion or whatever the number is. You're spending $10 million, and that's just in the realm of commercial finance rather than anything they want to necessarily invest in. And coupled with that, banks traditionally and lenders traditionally have wanted to see some sort of underpinning of a project with a long-term power purchase agreement, and that traditionally has been a little bit difficult to get sort of this 20-25 year de-risking contract, for example. So I do think some of these things are changing with this move of the finance industry into sustainable financial instruments, and they're now pushing their way towards green loans and putting their capital into green projects, environmentally beneficial projects. And that, I think, is actually mobilizing capital in sort of this area that we wanted to go into renewables ultimately. Yeah.
And Gavin?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a couple of potential obstacles I have in mind, but I think just expanding or picking up on something that Marc's touching on there about mobilising the capital is that I think the money is there, and there is, though, I think there's a dawning recognition on the people power required to actually make deals happen. So these transactions, even as they're getting bigger in size, there's still going to be more and more of them. And there are more players that we need to pull into investing in the industry. But again, this increases complexity. You need people who are experts at structuring and recognizing these risks and quantifying them, because they are talking about parting with a lot of cash. So we actually really need to be bringing in, the experts now. We need to be skilling up people who understand the industry and understand finance, and bringing them together. So there's a lot of, I think, kind of skills is an issue there in terms of investment. And I think you can push that a bit wider in terms of we need to do more, I think, to be bringing the skills that exist in industries like oil and gas, other energy industries, into renewables. So I think that's part of it. But I think the other thing that, similar to what we were saying about grid, I just think there's a potential lack of enough coordination between all the bodies that need to come together to kind of really make things happen. We talked about some of the key players there, but I think we need, as well as the regulators, government, industry, need to understand what the market looks like. So joined up approach within countries and between countries as different uses and sources of energy change. I think that lack of coordination coupled with not enough immediate action. We're all doing a lot, and that's fantastic, but we need to do more quickly because timelines on projects are long. You look at an offshore wind project, you could go from 10 years from getting your lease to actually being fully commissioned. So already, even if you got something today, might be 2030 before you're generating. So, this kind of 40 gigawatts by 2030 for offshore wind, we need to put things in place to make up the balance from what we've already got.
Yeah, and I suppose we are in a fortunate position with these two industries almost amalgamating, and a lot of the larger oil and gas companies doing this transformation. We have got great technology in both industries, and we've got great minds in both industries, both on the technological side and on the commercial side, with more experience coming from the oil and gas. And if we can get these great minds to work together, then the future certainly looks bright for this. but it is getting them talking and getting them moving sooner rather than later.
And I think building on that a little bit, there's there are certain companies within the oil and gas industry who've decided to, in their foray into renewables, concentrate on the things that they know how to do really well. And in particular, Shell and Equinor know how to build really big, robust things offshore really, really well. That's their bread and butter. So they've gone, well, offshore wind, that's a natural fit for our skill set. Other oil and gas companies have decided geothermal is a natural fit because they're very good at drilling holes and understanding what's going on subsurface. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the oil and gas industry as they obviously transform themselves into the energy companies of the future.
Excellent, thank you. And what role do you think data analysis has or should have in renewable energy decision making? Be that target setting, policy making, investment and planning, supply curve, and asset management. And if I could start with you first, Gavin, on this one.
Yeah, well, I think so. The positive for you there is I think you can take your pick out of all of those. I think something that's probably closest to my heart and thinking about our role in ORE Catapult is the value of data analytics within operations. So kind of a lot of, I'm again thinking about offshore wind, but renewable plant and any energy plant in general generates reams and reams of data. And not that many people have time to analyze it. And even when they do, it's not clear what you're looking for. So, kind of solutions which allow people to really understand the power of what's at their fingertips that they're generating even without any additional effort really, which allows them to streamline operations, kind of optimize what they're doing, and quite crucially maximize the revenue they can generate. It's very clear that with a lot of cost reduction, the pressure on that's hitting everyone. It's not just supply chain getting squeezed, it's also the generator there. The margins naturally are having to shrink. So you need to, best way to manage that is, to tap into new revenue streams. And so data that allows you to be able to see, more understanding of how close you're going to be to your predicted output, and you'll know which markets, which kind of balancing mechanisms, etc., that you can legitimately bid into. All of a sudden that gives you a different revenue stream and makes your business plan look quite different.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Marc, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, no, I certainly think there's a role for data analytics across the entire value chain. Absolutely. And in every industry, not just in renewables, let's be honest. But I think there's a couple of areas that spring out to mind. I suppose building on something that Gavin just said, the ability to watch markets. If you're a provider of energy storage, the ability to know the optimum time to bid into that market. And you just need to look at the Tesla/Neoen big battery in South Australia that's making a significant amount of money by injecting into the grid when the price is high, because it's a fully deregulated market on the East Coast. So I think that sort of advantage and a clear commercial benefit coming from that. And then from a grid point of view, I think there's a lot of future and a lot of potential in the area of predictive analytics when it comes to knowing how much you're going to be generating and when, and providing at least these short term, and you probably need 1 or 2 hours to manage the grid properly, short term forecasts of what we think we're going to be producing using weather and satellite information and all sorts, cloud cover for solar plants, etc. So yeah, I think huge potential in that area.
So using a company that can analyze all the different aspects of the data, like the weather and everything else coming in, will certainly help with revenue maximization.
Yeah, and I actually see this opportunity to have this overlay over the entire grid, supply and demand, and optimizing to an objective function, which is make sure that we're not using as much storage, or we're maximizing profit, or one of these things.
Yeah. I think that's something that you can just almost like the Internet of Things, but kind of joining up all these individual plants that have this data and then kind of bringing it together at grid level, but also a national level and beyond. It's in the end, it's about interfacing, and I think as we go forward, I think the more that data systems can be put in with a kind of thought that this is going to link in with something, at a national level or some other level, I think is going to add even more value. Hopefully then people can receive market signals instead of having to really work for them, which in the end is going to be to everyone's advantage, in terms of planning forward, where plans should go and what type.
And having some transparency with this data, because we know in the past, certainly in the oil and gas sector, data has been locked away and very private. Whereas I think the transparency that seems to be coming from the renewable and the willingness to data share across companies and across countries is really going to drive this forward and make sure that lessons are learned, which is great. Lastly, for the questions from my side, and then I think we'll move on to some audience questions, is the demand for gas is always likely to remain. Is green hydrogen the way forward? What do you guys think? Is it hype or hope? And I'll start with Marc on this one.
Yeah, sure. I've got a long history in hydrogen. I used to manage hydrogen plants and even looked after the refueling station for some hydrogen-powered buses in Perth once upon a time. So green hydrogen, hype or hope, it's at this stage possibly both. There's a lot of hurdles to make it fully commercial, and a lot of challenges, technical challenges, particularly around storage and transport. I don't think that's it's being researched, and there's lots of different ways of transporting hydrogen being explored, but you end up with physics limitations in that hydrogen's very small, it's very lightweight, it needs to be either really high pressure or really cold temperature to transport it in a commercial quantity as hydrogen, which is why some of these other things like ammonia or methyl cyclohexane become more interesting. Hydrogen itself, I think, is a big part of the energy transition and the energy future, insofar as it'll be used, I think, for large-scale grid-level storage, industrial applications, industrial feedstock as it is now, and heat applications as a replacement for natural gas, and large off-road transport miles away from any electricity. I think they're going to be sort of the core areas where it goes, but it really is just a matter now of getting the cost down, because to bridge that gap between $5 a kilo for green hydrogen, not including transport and storage, to the current price of diesel, say, you need a very high carbon price to bridge that gap. So if we can get the cost of green hydrogen down, then it'll be in there quite a lot. Yeah.
And Gavin?
Yeah, no, I think that's a lot of great points. It's such a big area, and I mean, you can't have too many conversations in energy just now without talking about hydrogen, I don't think. But I think, I mean, based on what Marc was saying there, a lot of, or pretty much any projection about net zero looks at hydrogen being a good part of the mix, and so it almost comes down to a question of, well, what kind of hydrogen is it? And as Marc's mentioned there, the biggest challenge at the moment with green hydrogen, so hydrogen produced purely from electricity from renewables, is the cost. But the good news, I would say, is that the biggest driver of green hydrogen cost is the electricity that goes into it. And as we know, that the cost of what's production from offshore wind is reducing. So the cost of what's been installed to date for offshore wind is relatively high, but if you look at auction prices, where we're actually looking at prices in line with or below wholesale prices, it's as cheap as electricity that you can be putting into electrolysis. And there's some nice things in terms of the scale of offshore wind that we're able to do in the UK, where some of the best wind resource, so thinking close again to my heart and to yours, Ian, I'm sure, up northeast of Scotland, fantastic wind, horrendous transmission charges because we're so far away from direct demand. So if you can be producing electricity there, converting to hydrogen and using it for off-grid solutions, so even vessel kind of transportation, fueling offshore somehow, other networks back to shore, I think there's a lot of potential there. So the work we've done on it shows that it's a must. And for me, the big question is, are we going to invest in green hydrogen soon enough so that we're leading the world with it, and that we don't invest in other types of hydrogen, which we're then going to regret later on?
Okay. Excellent. Thank you both. That I'm sure the audience will agree, but I found that extremely insightful, and we've had quite an active audience throughout this webinar. So what I'd like to do is go through some of their questions now. So the first one is, battery storage for solar energy continues to be extremely expensive, and wind is not always predictable in all parts of the world. What technologies are being applied or considered for the large-scale providers so that they can provide renewable energy 24/7 instead of having to make double investments? And if I start with Gavin on this.
They're in that kind of covers a lot of the stuff we've kind of picked up in terms of the challenges, I think. So it's the right questions. So I think there's almost a few, we're a bit of I wouldn't say a crossroads maybe, but are we going to invest in trying to bring down the cost of large scale storage, or are we going to think about an early play into hydrogen as a kind of seasonal, another kind of type of storage mechanism? So at the moment, I think we need to do more in terms, so the data analytics stuff in terms of matching up our supply and demand, so that we're able to kind of match them as far as possible. But I think with a lot of these things, the more you deploy, the faster the costs come down. So we kind of need to see a bit of a concerted push on storage, I think, if that's going to be a medium-term solution.
Yeah, I certainly think storage is such a huge part of the equation now. The question is, how do you get there, and what type of storage do you use? I have this chart that I show during presentations that I give around what storage works best where, in terms of size of storage and how long it discharges over, right? And that there is certainly a lot of focus on lithium ion right now, but that's not always the best place, the best deployment for, particularly for grid. Grid level storage, as you mentioned, Gavin, needs something that will actually last over a long period of time and can discharge relatively slowly and store loads of electricity. And now we're sort of pushed into these what I call more physical storage mechanisms, like hydrogen or pumped hydro or compressed air or all of these things, or all of the above, right? A mix of storage, and then different types of batteries as well. I mentioned redox flow batteries before, which are a really promising technology, but sort of fall by the wayside because of lithium ion. Lithium ion has its place, don't get me wrong, but I do think it might be in smaller applications, maybe home or suburb level storage. And I think there's a huge ability to also, when we're all driving electric cars, deploy that storage as well, because we've all got now storage that will be connected to the grid in some way. So having the ability to draw off that, the only danger is leaving the car owner with no storage and they need to go somewhere real quick. So I don't know how we get around that issue.
No, excellent. And we are running low on time, so I've had quite a few questions come in, but I'm going to go with one more each for you guys, because they've been actually tailored to you individually. So, Marc, if I start with you, how does the Southeast Asian energy market compare to the UK European market in terms of transition to decarbonization renewables?
Oh, yeah, good question. Well, I'm in Singapore, so Singapore made their big transition a long time ago and changed to gas. They invested quite a lot in combined cycle turbines. We end up with a pretty carbon efficient grid as a result, running at about 0.4 tons per megawatt hour. So Singapore's probably a little bit ahead of the curve. There's a lot of talk now of an ASEAN-wide grid, so connecting up the ASEAN nations, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to some of the big renewable sources like hydro in Laos, and then maybe running that down through Thailand, through Malaysia into Singapore. There's also been a lot of talk of running renewables up from Australia as well. There's a couple of companies looking at that now, again into Singapore, but potentially into Indonesia as well. So it's a real mixed bag across the region, and it depends a little bit on the level of development of the countries, and also I think how much coal they have. Like Philippines and Indonesia, loads of coal, like using coal to power their generation, to power their grid. And plus in Indonesia, there's a tendency to think gas might be a little bit less reliable. But Indonesia also has big geothermal. So yeah, it's really different from place to place. And there's certainly not an as wide strategy yet, but who knows what will happen in the future. There is a lot of potential for renewables. Not a great deal of wind, if I'm honest. It's not very windy here ever, but there's certainly quite a lot of solar around, and significant solar deployment in like Vietnam, Thailand, etc.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Marc. And Gavin, do you think it's going to be possible to meet the ambitious targets set by the UK and similar governments around the world? And is it a question of just lack of investment? And could we be doing more by including UK pension providers, advising their customers about the advantages of investing in renewable energy moving forward, so that this investment is not solely handled by the operators moving into this space?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, targets are always a big thing, and I think they're crucial to have people having having the objective in sight, and again, people going in the same direction. Things like, so the UK 40 gigawatts of offshore by 2030 is genuinely hugely ambitious. I think I can see us having more than 30 gigawatts operating by then, and with the balance, taking FID on, or at least, ready to go. Whether we have 40 operating by that point or not is another matter, but I can see line of sight to it. And I think similar would apply kind of elsewhere, where the targets being in place, this is now the time for people to be putting the policies in and actually make them happen. And I think that's the biggest thing is actually, I do think, from my engagement with industry and with the finance communities, that people are kind of, they're ready and waiting. They want to be putting their money where their mouth is. They want to be getting the construction going, but there still just needs to be a bit more understanding from regulators and policy to say that if, so let's take a 2030 target, because it's in our world that's pretty damn close now. As I was saying before, if you have whatever you've got in the pipeline just now, that's fine. You can kind of count that. But whatever you don't already have, kind of going through a planning process now, isn't going to be there in 2030. That kind of thing. So I would actually, in my thinking, I would like people to really kind of think about the practicalities, and then say what's important here is a doable, maybe a stretch 2030 target, and the same for 2040, but kind of, start working back from 2040 as well. And think, right, well, is there a danger that we're going to kind of try too hard to 2030 at the expense of what we do longer term? This is a big thing. So I would rather see ambitious long-term targets and realistic short-term ones, to be honest. So things like, there's a danger that we, in the UK and Europe, we ramp up our supply chains and deployment, to start meeting, in the UK, 3 gigawatts a year by the end of the 2020s. And then if we're not ambitious enough after that, we drop off, and the supply chain is just, well, thanks for that, we scaled up, now where's the business? So I think I would rather see, kind of ramp up the exponential rather than this kind of big steep line and then tailing off. So I think the more realistic in the short term and ambitious longer term would suit me fine.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So once again, thank you so much, Gavin, and thank you so much, Marc, for joining us and giving us and sharing with us your expertise and knowledge within this industry. Hopefully, as these webinars continue, we might get you involved for another one discussing renewable, as it is such a big part of our future. But once again, thank you very much, and thank you to all the audience. And I'm sorry if I didn't get through to all your questions. There was quite a few coming through there, but if there's any further questions, then please send those through to solutions@vroc.ai, and we will do everything we can to get them answered in a timely fashion. But yeah, thanks again, guys, and thank you to the audience, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Much pleasure.